Morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are in this world. This is Gloria White coming to you from Utah, USA. God bless you. Today we are continuing in the New Jerusalem Holy Bible, and we are in the book of 2nd Maccabees in chapter 8, verse 30. The defeat of Timotheus and Bacchides. They also challenged the forces of Timotheus and Bacchides and was destroyed, over 20,000 of them, gaining possession of several high fortresses. They divided their enormous booty into two equal shares, one for themselves, the other for the victims of the persecution and the orphans and the widows, not forgetting the aged. They carefully collected the enemy's weapons and stored them in suitable places. The rest of the spoils they took to Jerusalem. They killed the tribal chieftain on Timotheus's staff, an extremely wicked man who had done great harm to the Jews. In the course of their victory celebrations in Jerusalem, they burned the men who had fired the holy gates. With Chaldeans, they had taken refuge in one small house, so these received a fitting reward for their sacrilege. The flight and testimony of Nicanor. The triple-dyed scoundrel Nicanor, who had brought the 1,000 merchants to buy the Jews, finding himself with the Lord's help, humbled by men, he had himself reckoned as of very little account. Let me read that again. Verse 34. The triple-dyed scoundrel Nicanor, who had brought the 1,000 merchants to buy the Jews, finding himself with the Lord's help, humbled by men, he had himself reckoned as of very little account, stripped off his robes of state, and made his way across country unaccompanied, like a runaway slave, reaching Antioch by a single stroke of fortune, since his army had been destroyed. Thus the man who had promised the Romans to make good their tribute money by selling the prisoners from Jerusalem, bore witness that the Jews had a defender and that they were in consequence invulnerable, since they followed the laws that defender had ordained. We always hear how Jerusalem and Israel failed to keep the Lord's commandments, but here Nicanor is going and he's selling, since they followed the laws that their defender had ordained. The last days of Antioch Epiphanes, chapter 9. At about the same time, Antioch was beating a disorderly retreat from Persia. He had entered the city called Persepolis, planning to rob the temple and occupy the city. But the population at once sprang to arms to defend themselves, with the result that Antioch was routed by the inhabitants and forced to beat a humiliating retreat. On his arrival in Ecbatana, he learned what had happened to Nicanor and to Timotheus's forces. Flying into a passion, he resolved to make the Jews pay for the disgrace inflicted by those who had routed him. And with this in mind, he ordered his charioteer to drive without stopping and get the journey over. But the sentence of heaven was already hanging over him. In his pride, he had said, When I reach Jerusalem, I shall turn it into a mass grave for the Jews. But the all-seeing Lord, the God of Israel, struck him with an incurable and unseen complaint. The words were hardly out of his mouth when he was seized with an incurable pain in his bowels and with excruciating internal torture. And this was only right, since he had inflicted many barbaric tortures on the bowels of others. Even so, he in no way diminished his arrogance, still bursting with pride, breathing fire in his wrath against the Jews. He was in the act of ordering an even keener pace when the chariot gave a sudden lurch, and out he fell, and in this serious fall was dragged along, every joint of his body wrenched out of place. He who only a little while before had thought in his superhuman boastfulness he could command the waves of the sea, he who had imagined he could weigh mountain peaks in a balance, found himself flat on the ground and then being carried in a litter, a visible demonstration to all of the power of God, in that the very eyes of this godless man teemed with worms and his flesh rotted away while he lingered on in agonizing pain, and the stench of his decay sickened the whole army. A short while before, he had thought to grasp the stars of heaven. Now no one could bring himself to act as his bearer, for the stench was intolerable. Then and there, as a consequence, in his shattered state, he began to shed his excess pride and come to his senses under the divine lash. Spasms of pain overtaking him, his stench being unbearable even to himself, he exclaimed, "It is right to submit to God. No mortal should aspire to equality with the Godhead." The wretch began to pray to the Master, who would never take pity on him now, declaring that the holy city, towards which he had been speeding to raze it to the ground and turn it into a mass grave, should be declared free. As for the Jews, whom he had considered as not even worth burying, so much carrion to be thrown out with their children for birds and beasts to prey on, he would give them all equal rights with the Athenians. The holy temple which he had once plundered, he would now adorn with the finest offerings. He would restore all the sacred vessels many times over. He would defray from his personal revenue the expenses incurred for the sacrifices, and to crown all, he would himself turn Jew and visit every inhabited place, proclaiming the power of God. God can turn anybody at any time. So if you have those in your life who haven't accepted Christ, keep praying for them. Keep praying for them. Antioch writes to the Jews, finding no respite at all from his suffering, God's just sentence having overtaken him, he abandoned all hope for himself and wrote the Jews the letter transcribed below, which takes the form of an appeal in these terms. To the excellent Jews, to the citizens, Antioch, king and commander-in-chief, sends hearty greetings, wishing them all health and prosperity. If you and your children are well, and your affairs as you would wish, we are profoundly thankful. For my part, I cherish affectionate memories of you. On my return from the country of Persia, I fell seriously ill, and thought it necessary to make provision for the common security of all. Not that I despair of my condition, for I have great hope of shaking off the malady, but considering how my father, whenever he was making an expedition into the uplands, would designate his successor, so that in case of any unforeseen event or disquieting rumor, the people of the provinces might know to whom he had left the conduct of affairs, and thus remain undisturbed. Furthermore, being well aware that the sovereigns of our frontiers and the neighbors of our realm are watching for opportunities and waiting to see what will happen, I have designated as king my son Antioch, whom I have more than once entrusted and commended to most of you when I was setting out for the upland satrap satrapies. A transcript of my letter to him is appended here too. I therefore urge and require you, being mindful of the benefits both public and personal received from me, that you each persist in those sentiments of goodwill that you harbor towards me. I am confident that he will pursue my own policy with benevolence and humanity, and will prove accommodating to your interest. And so this murderer and blasphemer have endured sufferings as terrible as those which he had made others endure, met his pitiful fate, and ended his life in the mountains far from his home. His comrade Philip brought back his body, and then, fearing Antiochus' son, withdrew to Egypt, to the court of Ptolemy Philometor. The purification of the temple. Chapter 10. Maccabeus and his companions, under the Lord's guidance, restored the temple and the city, and pulled down the altars erected by the foreigners in the marketplace, as well as the shrines. They purified the sanctuary and built another altar. Then, striking fire from flints, and using this fire, they offered the first sacrifice for 2 years, burning incense, lighting the lamps, and setting out the loaves. When they had done this, prostrating themselves on the ground, they implored the Lord never again to let them fall into such adversary, but if they should ever sin, to correct them with moderation, and not to deliver them over to blasphemous and barbarous nations. This day of the purification of the temple fell on the very day on which the temple had been profaned by the foreigners, the 25th of the same month, Chislev. They kept 8 festive days with rejoicing, in the manner of the Feast of Shelters, remembering how, not long before at the time of the Feast of Shelters, or Tabernacles, they had been living in the mountains and caverns like wild beasts. Then carrying Thyrus's leafy boughs and palms, they offered hymns to him who had brought the cleansing of his own holy place to a happy cleansing of his own holy place to a happy outcome. They also decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, that the whole Jewish nation should celebrate those same days every year. We're going to stop there because the next is section 6, the struggle of Judas against the neighboring peoples and against Laius and minister of Antioch the 5th. I tell you, when you read this book, it's quite full of reality at every turn. The way the Israelites persisted, those that believed in God and held Him in high esteem and worshiped Him, how they fought for Him, how they laid down their lives for Him, how they cherished the temple and rejoiced when it was set up again. Amazing, amazing people. They're not just, names in this book. They were actual people, and they actually did these things. The Bible is not a fairy tale, as some people would say. And every word proceedeth from the mouth of God. When you open your Bible and you start to read, acknowledge those are the words of God, written by the hand of man, for the benefit of us, His children. He loves us so much. Guys, don't ever forget how much He loves us. And as always, I love you.